there's a little bit of recruiting news in the last couple days. No commitments necessarily, but I gotta start with something I'm a little pet peeve of mine, if I'm being honest. Jackson Cantwell came out with a top 14 that includes Nebraska. And I get it's a big deal that Nebraska's still in this recruitment and they, that's exciting for them. I struggle with the top 14s, Tim. Like, that doesn't mean a lot to me. Could we get it into single digits before we start releasing lists? Is that an unreasonable ask?
I completely agree. In this instance specifically, I remember I talked to Jackson last month just to catch up with him, kind of see where things were at. And he mentioned like, hey, once my recruitment blew up the way it is pretty much just down to a dozen or so schools. And I was like, okay, so like, what are those schools? And he started listing off some names and some of the names that are obviously in that top 14. But talking to him about it, and it just, for him specifically, this is more of just like an exercise for him and his family and everybody to just kind of, hey, this is what we're whittling the list. This is who we're focusing on moving forward. And like, yeah, I get it. Like a top 14 is a little crazy, but there's a kid with 30 plus offers, like cutting that list pretty much in half.
Is it more about, for a guy like that, to kind of let the other schools know, like, hey, I don't want you to have to try and like keep wasting your time. Like, we're not really considering you anymore, and just kind of like publicly getting that out there. Like, is that part of what these lists are?
Yes, absolutely. For some of these guys, especially a kid like Cantwell, and you talk to some of these guys that are highly recruited in the way some of these top 5 stars are, they get real sick of the process by their junior, senior year, especially a guy like Cantwell who's been recruited as long as he has. They get real sick of it. They just want, like, again, we're focusing on this many schools. We only want to hear from these many schools. We don't really want to hear from you've had your chance, you gave it your best shot, you're not in it anymore type. But that's kind of how it is with a lot of these guys. Even those top 5s, top whatever, like those, when they drop lists, I remember talking to like coaches and parents of recruits, and they're like, we cut the list down in hopes that this would quiet things down around the recruitment. Usually it doesn't. Schools are still going to reach out, but at the same time, it does give them that warning of just like, hey, you're not in consideration anymore. Like, don't waste your time.
It's funny you say that, because a lot of people, they look at recruiting and they go, kids these days, they love to be recruited. They love to be courted. So then when I hear you say, no, actually, like, especially for the kids at the top, right? They're hearing from everybody. And so, yeah, I can imagine by the end of your junior year, you're like, bruh, can we just get this thing? I just want to focus on football now.
Right. Yeah, it's exactly that. Obviously there are kids that fall in love with the process itself more than actual, football or actual like trying to make a good decision. There are those type of kids, but for the most part, it's just, like you're saying, especially those guys at the top, they do get real sick of that process, especially by the end. Like, they're all just ready to have it done with. I think that's why you're seeing, especially now in these last couple of cycles and moving forward, you're going to see a lot more decisions come in the summer where guys are just like, once it's done, I'm shutting things down. I'm just focusing on the season. A lot of Nebraska's current commits are that way. They're not open to any other schools right now. They're not even listening to the recruiting side of things. They're locked in with Nebraska. That's the way it is across the country right now. A lot of these guys are pretty locked in with where they're at. There's going to be some flips down the stretch. That's just always how it is. But for the most part, the ones that are committed now, it's because it's like, hey, we're pretty done with the process.
So let me ask about Jackson Cantwell specifically. Obviously, Nebraska makes the top 14. How would you handicap Nebraska's chances? Like, I don't know. You don't have to like rank him within the 14, but do you think there's a legitimate opportunity there for Nebraska?
Yes, I do. He's visited campus a couple times already. Nebraska is one of the few schools that he's done that. Maybe one of the only schools. I think Missouri and I believe Georgia are the only other 2 schools that have gotten him on campus more than once so far. And I asked him, I was like, why do you why Nebraska? Like, what about Nebraska has you stopping by? Because it's just relatively short drive, but like where he's at, Nixa, Missouri, that's like 5-6 hours from Lincoln. Like, it's not necessarily an easy drive. It's not like getting to Columbia, which is 2-3 hours for him. So I asked him about it, and he's like, my relationships with the coaching staff there are really strong and some of the best I have in this recruitment. And that's not just, it's Matt Rhule, it's Donovan Raiola, it's Keith Williams, it's some recruiting staffers, but Keith Williams specifically has been big here, as have, obviously Rhule and Raiola. So it's relationships here. He wants to do both sports. He's obviously in Olympic level, like he's a son of 2 Olympians. He's the junior record holder or sophomore record holder in the shot put, high school overall record holder, I believe, in shot put as well right now. And so he wants to throw at the next level. And, Nebraska's shown you can do both sports here and have success, and we know how to maintain your schedule, and we know what we're doing. Like, they've already gotten him in some of those meetings and already like, hey, go talk to Jalen Lloyd, go talk to Jeremiah Charles, see how they enjoy doing both sports here. Like, we have a plan for you if you want to do both here, which a lot of schools, like, they don't even have that plan. Like, they can't even point to examples, and Nebraska has multiple on campus already.
Speaking of guys that Nebraska might have a very good chance with, and excuse me if I butcher the name, Cade Peterzak?
Yes. Cool. Peterzak, yes.
So 6'5", 240, out of defensive lineman out of North Dakota. Oklahoma lean, it looked like, for a little bit there. But go into Cade Peterzak's recruitment and like where Nebraska stands with him right now.
Yeah, this one's been a really interesting one to follow. Cade doesn't talk a lot, if at all. I don't think he's done an interview on the record yet. And it's been pretty difficult to kind of get a read on that recruitment. Like, primarily my sourcing has been from other staffs and kind of talking to people kind of that are in the know about his recruitment. But like, it's been hard to get anything out of him directly. That being said, this is one that has swung in Nebraska's direction over the last few days or so. I got yesterday, I got a couple texts from a couple different staffs being like, hey, this is all of a sudden looking like it's going to be Nebraska. And which is interesting because going into June and even coming out of June, through those official visits, so basically going to June official visit period, we had heard he had tried to commit to Oklahoma, but then Oklahoma was like, hey, we have a no visit policy. You wouldn't be allowed to visit anywhere else. So he was like, let me go take my visits. I want to make sure I'm doing my due diligence here, but I'm coming. Like, he told Oklahoma, I'm coming. And did a visit OV to Wisconsin, went to Oklahoma, then Nebraska, then Kansas State. So Nebraska was sandwiched right between Oklahoma and Kansas State. And coming out of the Oklahoma visit, I heard the same thing, just like he felt at home. It felt like this was going to be the place. Nebraska went well, is the way it was put to me, but wasn't really expanded on beyond that. But then coming out of that Kansas State visit, they were like, hey, this is going to be a Kansas State and Oklahoma recruitment down the stretch. Like, Kansas State has made this thing interesting. And now we're sitting here, and Nebraska's the one that has the momentum, which Nebraska hasn't had the momentum in here in a couple of months. Like, it's been since like April or so since I've heard concrete like momentum for Nebraska here, which is a testament to Rhule and Raiola, their effort here, kind of maintaining, like, this is a dead period. Like, Nebraska somehow made up their ground in a dead period. The kid didn't come back on campus. They didn't go out and visit him. They weren't able to do that, of course. So this is just pure communication. Part of it is him sitting down and evaluating these 4 options that he made official visits to. And, the combination of all those different things, we're now sitting here on Friday, July 19th, heading into the weekend. And it's like, hey, Nebraska's trending in this recruitment and could get him to pop here pretty soon.
Tim, okay, yeah, I got a couple questions based on kind of your answer there about Cade Peterzak. First, I'm just curious, how common is as a policy like Oklahoma's, where like, hey, if you commit, there's no visits? Because that's definitely different than what we've seen here at Nebraska, where Coach Rhule actively encourages guys to explore their options even after they're committed, and like doesn't really seem to have a problem with it at all. Like, is that Oklahoma rule a common practice these days? Because I'm not sure I've heard of that before.
It's a common practice at certain schools like that. Oklahoma's pretty much just stems from what Venables saw Dabo do at Clemson. Those two are obviously notorious for kind of handling recruiting a little differently. So it does pretty much just stem from that. But Oklahoma kind of does this thing where it's like, you got to be all in to commit to us type, like that's just kind of the way they view it. Not necessarily a bad thing. I don't think I necessarily disagree with it, but in this day and age, like you have to understand to recruit certain kids, you got to put up with, a little bit of that. Hey, this kid's going to explore a little bit. Like, there are going to be other options out there for him. Like, and so it may keep them away from certain recruitments, but it does also at the same time, like knowing what I know about that class, knowing what I know about the program, they get the type of kids they want, like the guys that truly do commit there are the guys they want because of that policy. Same with Clemson. And obviously, it's hurt Clemson a little bit because Clemson refuses to play the NIL game while Oklahoma does. And so you're seeing that's kind of like why these two paths are kind of going differently. Oklahoma's trending down. Oklahoma's trending up. Clemson's trending down. But I mean, beyond that, I think a lot of schools have it unspoken, like certain kids within your recruiting class, like, hey, if you're lower on our commit list and we're considering dropping you anyway, and then you go make visits elsewhere, that's not going to go over super well. Like I know that's a case at a lot of different schools where they won't outright say it, but you see a kid make a visit and then a couple of weeks later they're like, hey, I'm decommitting, and then you ask around and school's like, no, yeah, that he it wasn't a him decision, it was an us decision. Like that happens sometimes.
And Tim, my other question there is, so Cade Peterzak, what type of player, if he does end up going to Nebraska, like what type of player would Nebraska be getting there? Because I know he's listed as a D lineman, but you mentioned Raiola is active as part of his recruiting. Is this the guy they're kind of looking at maybe being able to play either way? Is he strictly a defensive lineman? Like, what are your thoughts on him as an actual player?
Yeah. Oh, I misspoke. So Raiola was for Cantwell, but here was
gotcha.
Knighton.
Okay.
But yes. But this has been Knighton. No. He does play both ways. But Nebraska's kind of solely looked at him as a defensive lineman, and it's not hard to see why on film. Yeah, he's just there's some rawness there. Obviously, playing against North Dakota competition, playing where he plays at. There's some natural, like, hey, he's going to need some technique development. He's going to need some just like rein him in a little bit, because I say that to say he plays with an aggression you can't coach. You watch his film, and this is the guy, he explodes off the line. That first step explosion is another thing that just, it's rare to find at that size, and it's not something you can really develop. That's just something you inherit and you take and mold into like a defensive line, like a high level defensive lineman. He's got a really impressive first step. Good striking power just off the line, plays with good leverage for his size, which again, for a guy that has limited, somewhat limited like coaching up there in North Dakota, to maintain that leverage is a difficult thing. And so the fact that he's got it pretty consistently is pretty impressive. So he does a good job with that, explodes off the line. And then, like just closes with like that intention to punish. Like you watch him, like he's always trying to finish plays, whether that's like, I want to be the one on top of the quarterback here. I want to be the one on top of the ball carrier here. I'm the one that's diving on the loose ball. Like he wants to finish plays. He's got an unrelenting motor. You watch this film, I think it's a couple minutes into it, you see him like 30, 40 yards downfield chasing down a ball carrier. Like it's not normal for a defensive lineman. He's impressive, man. It fits the vision of what Terrence Knighton's trying to build with this D line. Like the two commits they have so far are Malcolm Simpson and Tyson Terry. Both those guys can kind of play all over the line. You can add some weight to them. They can move inside, trim them down a little bit. They can play even like Jack potentially, or for sure defensive end. And then you look at Cade, and he very much fits into that. Like would probably start his career out at defensive end. Could even slim down and be a Jack if they wanted like a true pass rush presence Jack. But also has the frame to add, I think he's closer to 250, 260 than is listed 240 right now. But he can get up close to 300 plus pounds and hold it pretty well, like just looking at his frame right now.
I think everything you just said about Peterzak is just straight up red meat. Picked in a ball carrier 40 yards downfield? What? Sounds like my kind of guy. Going back to Donovan Raiola, as fans, and on our podcast, we were lucky to have Tony Ufinotti on a few months ago, and we were talking about Raiola and trying to establish that poly pipeline. So when you bring in guys like Taumua, Brian Tapu, Houston, Kahania Torres. Are there any other future poly targets that you're aware of that they're trying to get?
Yeah, there's a few. They're really trying to establish themselves in Hawaii. They offered his name is Tamaine Purcell. He's a 2026 tight end out of Kamehameha. So they're after him. Ace Amina is a 2026 or 2028 quarterback at Bishop Gorman. He came in camp this summer, earned an offer. That's one down the line. 2027 quarterback Fury and Ferreira at Mater Dei out in California. That's another one. They're really trying to establish themselves out in the West Coast with and yeah, like you said, like those poly pipelines. They're really trying to strengthen. As far as this cycle, it's not that many left really out there, if any. But yeah, looking ahead to 26 and 27, I think you're going to see a bigger presence from them out in Utah, out in California, out in Hawaii. Just trying to build that pipeline, like you said. I think there's a his name's slipping me, but there's a safety at Jackson Toloa. He's a 2026 safety at Salt Lake City West, same school that Brian Tepu's from. He's a really fun player to watch. Like you watch, that's a 6'2", 6'3" safety, like really rangy. Like you watch his tape and you're like, man, this is probably what Kyle Hamilton looked like in high school. Like just a big rangy safety, covers a lot of ground. And he's physical. He's a lot of fun to watch.
We're talking with Tim Verghese of Inside Nebraska. Tim, we've talked a lot of offensive line recruiting here in the segment so far. Like, have you heard from recruits? Because I know you talk to these guys as much as you can. Like, what about Donnie Raiola kind of resonates with these guys? Because a lot of what we see from him is pretty, kind of reserved, doesn't really say a lot. But obviously there's something about this guy that is getting Nebraska into some conversations, whether it's, David Sanders Jr., who I know they're hoping comes and visits next to kind of hope and get another shot at him. We talked about Jackson Cantwell. We talked about all these other guys that have already committed or signed with Nebraska. Grant Bricks being kind of the most high profile one last year. Like, have you heard like a common thread about Raiola that makes him so kind of compelling to these guys?
Yeah. For them specifically, it's the what you get, the on-field Raiola and then the off-the-field Raiola. Like that's the big thing for them that really resonates with them is, we saw it in some of the open practices we were at. He's fired up on the field. Like he'll get on you. He'll like, he's really about it. Like he's really locked in those lines. But for guys that are like, I want to be coached like a guy like that on the field because I know outside of the field, he's got my back. I can go to him for anything. I can really connect with him. They really appreciate his teaching style. Like, again, like Nebraska teaches O-line a little differently than most programs, not in a bad way or necessarily a good way necessarily, but the common thing I hear from recruits is like, yeah, it's a little different, but Donovan does a really good job. Coach Raiola does a really good job of explaining it to us and laying it out for us in a way that we can understand and the transition isn't too hard and we understand kind of where he's coming from and why they do it the way they do there. Like, guys don't leave Nebraska being like, they do it differently, it's weird. They leave Nebraska being like, they do it differently, but I get it. Like, and that's a common thing. Like, that's not something like 1-2 recruits I've heard. Like, that's like every O-line recruit I've been like, hey, Nebraska coaches O-line differently. Like, how does that work for you? And, or how do you kind of, how do you feel about it? And they're like, yeah, Donovan makes it easy for us. Like, like he does a really good job of like kind of laying out like what the expectations are, why it'd be different here. And again, like he breaks down the fundamentals with these guys and O-line at their core, especially the high level, like the high achieving performing ones, they want to be yelled at. They want like, that tough love coaching on the field. And they just want a community off the field. And Raiola's done a really good job of like building that with that trust with himself and his players, but also building that culture where the players are like one family unit.
And sticking with Raiola for a little bit, I'll just say, as a common fan, you see him come over from the Bears, and the question is, oh, he was just like a assistant to the assistant kind of guy, and we were skeptical, and it's like, oh, he only came here because they wanted to get his nephew on board and all that. And you look at the way he's been recruiting, and just on the field, it looks like the O-line has been making improvements. I just got to say, as a fan myself, it's just so refreshing to see him really break through in this role. So
yeah, it's been cool to see him kind of start to kind of flourish and yeah, like you were saying too. I think the narrative when he first got hired, and you think about the timing of when he got hired too, like kind of everyone kind of knew at that point, it's like, oh man, like this is kind of do or die for Scott Frost. It's like, this is the O-line hire. Like, are we sure? And it's worked out where he's the only staffer that was retained from that staff, or one of the few that was for sure the only on-field one that was retained from that staff. And beyond that, like, just the way he's kind of found his groove on the recruiting side of things. It's not something he's done, but he's done a really good job of like finding the type of guys he wants, the type of guys Nebraska has. Like, Briggs is a big one for last cycle, but beyond him, like, Gibson Pyle came in the spring and did better than people expected. Like, that's a guy that could factor into that like offensive guard rotation pretty early, and that staff is starting to kind of fall in love with Gibson, or they really likes what they have in Gibson. Landon Davidson just arrived on campus. That's another guy that, like, bit of a sleeper, but give him some time to kind of learn everything, and he's got the frame already. Like, he can contribute on the inside too. Like, they get guys that beyond those top end like elite talent like Bricks and the guys that are after this cycle, like they're finding guys like even Tapu. Like, that's a hell of a find. Like, that's a guy with limited offers, limited tape. Like, you didn't need to take a chance there, but you took a chance there. And this is a guy that with 2 years of development could be like an elite tackle. Like, there's elite movement skills in that frame.
Tim, we appreciate the time as always. Super good stuff this morning, and we will talk to you again next week.
Yes, sir. Of course. Y'all have a good weekend.
Thanks, Tim.
You too. That's Tim Verghese from Inside Nebraska. Great stuff there from Tim. I'm just sitting here living the pipe dream of David Sanders Jr., Jackson Cantwell, both on campus. And like he said something about Jackson Cantwell, the two-sport athlete thing. Watch out for that.
I heard shot put, and I'm like, there it is.
That's a great equalizer for guys that care about two sports and are good at two sports. That is something, like, if you offer that to them and other people aren't, like, your chances go through the roof. I just went from top 14, whatever, to, okay, this might be a real thing.
Get them on campus, baby.
Let's do it. Coming up next, we've got more Hurrdat Sports Radio, AM 590, ESPN Omaha, ESPN Tri-Cities.